Imagine a wealthy, big-city doctor who has it all: prestige, money, and a high-powered job in a cutting-edge hospital. Dr. David Sanchez was that man, living a life of luxury in Manhattan, where his skills as a cardiac surgeon made him a legend in the medical community. But beneath his success lay a void he couldn't fill. Burnout, divorce, and a growing sense of detachment from what truly mattered pushed him to the edge. In a desperate search for purpose, he volunteers at a remote rural clinic in Pine Hollow, a place where resources are scarce and the needs of the community are vast. There, he meets Elizabeth Gonzalez, a nurse whose compassion and dedication to her patients are unparalleled. Her ability to connect with people, her tireless work ethic, and her unwavering commitment to the well-being of others captivate David from the start. As they work side by side, treating patients with limited supplies and facing challenges that would have seemed unimaginable in his previous life, David begins to fall for Elizabeth. Their bond grows stronger with each passing day, and the air between them crackles with unspoken feelings. But love takes an unexpected turn when David starts noticing small inconsistencies in Elizabeth's story. Her schooling, previous jobs, and even her name don't add up. Digging deeper, he uncovers a shocking truth. Elizabeth is using a fake identity to hide a criminal record. Once convicted for stealing medication from a hospital pharmacy to ease her dying mother's pain, she took the fall to protect her family and started over in Pine Hollow. Torn between his duty to uphold the law and his growing love for Elizabeth, David faces a moral dilemma that challenges everything he thought he knew about justice, compassion, and second chances. As Elizabeth prepares to leave town, assuming David will turn her in, he makes a decision that will change both their lives forever. Instead of exposing her, he chooses to help clear her name, determined to fight for the truth and bring justice to those who wronged her. Together, they embark on a journey to uncover hidden truths and seek redemption in a world that often blurs the lines between right and wrong. Can love triumph over the law? Will their fight for justice lead to a new beginning, or will it destroy everything they've built? Let's dive into this gripping tale of love, lies, and redemption. David Sanchez had always been the kind of guy who lived by the book. A cardiac surgeon in Manhattan with a six-figure salary and a penthouse overlooking Central Park, he'd spent years saving lives in sterile operating rooms where the only sounds were the beeps of machines. But something felt hollow. After a painful divorce and a burnout that left him staring at his reflection in the subway, he'd scribbled a resignation letter and booked a flight to the Ozarks. "Time to give back," he'd muttered to his best friend, who just rolled her eyes and said, "You're running from something, Dave." The rural clinic in Pine Hollow was a far cry from the neon lights of New York. It smelled of antiseptic and dated coffee, with peeling paint and a waiting room that doubled as a storage closet. The first day, David fumbled with the rustic equipment: a blood pressure cuff that stuck to his fingers, a thermometer that wouldn't beep. A local farmer walked in with a gash on his arm, blood smearing his flannel shirt, and David's hands trembled as he sutured. "Relax, Doc," the man rasped. "Ain't nothing fancy round here." Pine Hollow was a place where time moved slower. Patients arrived on tractors, kids tagged along with parents who'd skipped meals to afford medication. David learned to barter a jar of honey for a vaccination, a handmade quilt for an ultrasound. At night, he'd sit on his porch, staring at the stars, and wonder if this was what redemption felt like. "You're softening," his wife's voice echoed in his head. But the clinic's director, a non-nonsense woman named Clara, just winked. "Wait till you meet Nurse Liz." Elizabeth Gonzalez showed up at dawn. Her uniform was crisp, her bun impossibly neat, and her smile warm enough to melt the morning frost. "Dr. Sanchez, right?" she said, shaking his hand like a politician. "I've heard about your, city ways." David bristled, then laughed. She had a way of disarming him, cracking jokes about his fancy MD while slicing potatoes for the community soup kitchen. "You're either a saint or a sociopath," he teased, betting on saint. The clinic's walls didn't just hold medical records, they held stories. A teenager with asthma who'd been hospitalized 3 times because his family couldn't afford inhalers. A widow with diabetes who shared her insulin with her diabetic dog. David found himself staying late, typing grant proposals on a rickety desk, while Elizabeth hummed old Spanish ballads. "Why'd you come here?" she asked once. "Closure? Adventure?" He stared at the wall. Maybe I just needed to feel useful again. One evening, as David was closing up the clinic, he noticed a small pile of letters addressed to Elizabeth on her desk. The handwriting was familiar, his own. He'd written them years ago when they briefly crossed paths in a New York hospital, but the letters were never sent. He picked one up, his heart racing. "Liz," he whispered, realizing he'd never truly forgotten her. Elizabeth Gonzalez entered the clinic like a breath of fresh air. Her uniform was always spotless, her gloves perfectly fitted, and her stethoscope hung around her neck like a badge of honor. David watched as she tended to a crying child with a scraped knee, pulling a cartoon bandage from her pocket and sticking it on with a wink. "There we go," she said softly. "Now you're a superhero." The kid giggled and the mother smiled through tears. David couldn't help but feel a pang of admiration. "You're good at this," he said later, as she logged patient notes on a dusty computer. She glanced up, her eyes sharp. "It's more than a job, Dr. Sanchez. These people don't just need stitches, they need someone to listen." Her words hung in the air, challenging him. He remembered city hospitals, where patients were numbers and efficiency mattered more than empathy. "You make it look easy," he admitted. That afternoon, Elizabeth led a diabetes workshop in the community center. Farmers and retirees gathered around tables covered in fruit models and glucose meters. She demonstrated how to check blood sugar levels, her voice patient and clear. "This isn't just about medicine," she told them. "It's about taking care of each other." David lingered in the back, struck by her passion. It was the kind of care he'd forgotten was possible. Over iced coffee at the diner, Elizabeth shared stories of her upbringing in a small Texas town. "My abuela taught me to heal with what you have," she said, stirring her drink. "Aloe vera for burns, chamomile for anxiety." David listened, charmed by her humility. "You're part pharmacist, part therapist," he joked. "And all heart," she shot back, her smile softening. The clinic's garden became their unofficial meeting spot. Elizabeth would tend to the herbs, while David read medical journals aloud, his voice blending with the rustle of leaves. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, she paused. "You ever think about staying?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded. "Sometimes." As David packed his bag after a long day, he found an old photo of Elizabeth tucked in a drawer. It showed her at a graduation ceremony, wearing a nursing cap and gown. But the name on the diploma wasn't Elizabeth Gonzalez. His fingers tightened around the paper. "What are you hiding?" he wondered, his admiration tinged with doubt. Elizabeth's days began before sunrise. She'd arrive at the clinic while the world was still dark, her headlamp cutting through the morning mist. The supply closet was a joke expired bandages, a single box of gloves, and a medication stock that could barely fill a pharmacy's trash bin. But she made do. Once, she'd fashioned a splint from a cardboard box and a belt when a farmer broke his wrist falling off a tractor. "Creative solutions," she'd shrug, as David gaped at her ingenuity. The community adored her. Old Mrs. Higgins, who lived alone with her rheumatoid arthritis, would save Elizabeth fresh eggs from her chickens. "For the nurse who doesn't turn up her nose at dirt," she'd say, pressing them into Elizabeth's hands. When a flu outbreak hit, Elizabeth organized a vaccination drive in the town square, borrowing tables from the fire department and convincing David to play DJ with his phone. "Gotta keep morale up," Shed grinned as patients danced to Elvis between shots. David often found her in the clinic's backyard, mending fences or planting vegetables for the food bank. "Why aren't you resting?" he'd ask, exasperated. "These people are—" "My family," she'd reply, her voice firm. "You don't abandon family." Her dedication was a silent rebuke to his privileged past. One chilly morning, as she treated a baby with pneumonia using a makeshift nebulizer, a soda bottle, and a straw, David realized he'd never seen such raw, unselfish care. The clinic's whiteboard was her masterpiece. Patient names, symptoms, and follow-up. Dates were written in neat columns. Next to each entry was a personal note: "John needs a ride to chemo. Mariah's diabetes meds are MIA again." Elizabeth managed it all with the precision of a general. "You're running a war room," David remarked. "Someone's got to keep the chaos in check," she said, her eyes twinkling. Yet there were moments when her composure wavered. Late one night, after delivering a stillborn baby, Elizabeth collapsed in the supply closet, her shoulders shaking. David found her there, her face buried in her hands. "I've held so many lives," she whispered, "but some you can't save." He stood awkwardly, unsure if she wanted comfort. Instead, she straightened, wiped her eyes, and said, "Let's order more blankets. The nursery's cold." As David reviewed patient files one evening, he noticed a pattern: Elizabeth's applications for medical aid were always mysteriously approved. He dug deeper and found she'd been using her personal savings to cover gaps. When he confronted her, she just smiled. "Rules are flexible when lives are at stake," she said. "Sometimes you gotta break a few to keep the lights on." The first time David realized he was falling for Elizabeth was during a house call in the rain. They'd driven to a dilapidated farmhouse to check on old Mr. Jenkins, whose COPD had worsened. The truck got stuck in the mud, and Elizabeth laughed as David rolled up his sleeves and pushed. "Rich boys don't do dirt," she teased. "Rich boys learn." "Fast," he shot back, his heart pounding, not from the effort, but from the way she looked, alive and mud-splattered under the truck's dim light. Their lunch breaks became a ritual. Elizabeth would pull a thermos of green chile stew from her bag, and David would share protein bars from his city diet. They'd sit on the clinic steps, trading stories. She told him about her brother's auto repair. Shop in El Paso, he confessed he'd never changed a tire. Life skills 101, she smirked. He loved how her eyes lit up when she talked about her nieces, how she'd braid their hair after shifts. It was the small things that undid him. One sweltering afternoon, Elizabeth found David napping in the clinic's storage room, escaped from the Texas heat. She draped a woven blanket over him, her fingers brushing his shoulder. "You look like you've been sleep-deprived since med school," she said softly. He opened his eyes to find her hovering, concern etched on her face. The air between them thickened. He sat up too fast, the blanket slipping away. "Thanks," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. The tension peaked during a community fair. Elizabeth wore a sun hat and a sundress that fluttered in the breeze, and David couldn't look away. She organized a first aid booth, demonstrating CPR on a dummy while he handed out sunscreen. When a toddler wandered off, she sprinted after the child, David, right behind. They found the boy with his parents, Elizabeth's hands on her knees as she caught her breath. "You're fast for a city slicker," she panted. "Only when it matters," he replied, his voice low. That evening, David stayed late at the clinic, pretending to organize files. Elizabeth walked in, her hair still damp from the fair's sprinklers. "You working or stalking?" she asked, grinning. He chuckled nervously. "Just thinking." She leaned against the desk, her smile fading. "About what?" The question hung there, heavy with unspoken words. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The next morning, David found a note on his porch. "The clinic's board meeting is tomorrow. Thought you want to come?" "Liz." His thumb traced the Z in her signature, imagining the curve of her hand as she wrote it. He realized then that he wasn't just respecting her, he was falling for someone who made him feel alive in a way his old life never did. The first red flag was the diploma on her wall. It showed her as Elizabeth Martinez, not Gonzalez. David spotted it during a late-night shift when he wandered into her office looking for ibuprofen. The name seemed off, but he shrugged. It off maybe a maiden name? Yet her resume listed Gonzalez throughout. He made a mental note, then ignored it. After all, she was the best nurse he'd ever seen. Then there was the time she mentioned her former clinic in Albuquerque. David, curious, later searched for it online during his lunch break. Nothing. No records, no website, no reviews. Just a vacant lot with weeds. He told himself it was a small oversight, a mix-up, but as he scrolled through search results, his stomach knotted. Her stories about her past were a patchwork quilt, vivid in parts, vague in others. She spoke often of her brother in El Paso, but never mentioned their parents. When David asked about her nursing school, she waved it off. Small state college, she said, avoiding eye contact. The dismissal felt rehearsed, like she'd perfected it over years. One afternoon, as they restocked the clinic's meds, David noticed her carefully avoiding the locked cabinet where the strong painkillers were stored. He'd seen her do it before, always finding reasons to stay across the room when it was opened, just being cautious, she'd say. But the wariness in her eyes told another story. The final clue came during a routine checkup. An elderly patient, Mrs. O'Connor, mentioned how Liz had treated her in Boston years back. David froze. "Boston?" he asked. "Yeah, sweet girl," Mrs. O'Connor nodded. "Left suddenly after some trouble." David's mind raced. Boston. Her resume said Texas. He excused himself, his hands clammy. That night, David sat on his porch, staring at the clinic's dark windows. The pieces didn't fit. Her name, her past jobs, her unexplained wariness, it all added up to something he didn't want to face. Yet, he couldn't unsee it. Trust was a fragile thing, he realized, especially when your heart was already leaning towards someone. The cracks in Elizabeth's story multiplied. Like fishes in dry earth, her resume listed a nursing degree from the University of Texas at Austin. But David's discreet call to the registrar's office revealed no record of an Elizabeth Gonzalez or Elizabeth Martinez. When he confronted her casually over coffee, she laughed. "It off. UT's huge," she said. "Maybe they misplaced my files." But her eyes darted away, betraying her. Then there was the mystery of her previous employers. She had mentioned working at a bustling hospital in Albuquerque, yet when David visited the place himself during a weekend trip, staff there had never heard of her. The photo she'd shown him of her old team turned out to be a generic nursing conference. Image from a Google search he later reverse-engineered. "People get mixed up," she insisted when he brought it up. Or maybe I'm just forgetful. Her social media footprint was practically non-existent, a red flag, in an age where everyone curated digital lives. A single Instagram account under Liz G featured blurry photos of sunsets and potted plants, the kind of account people create to seem less mysterious. "I hate taking selfies," she shrugged. David's gut churned. How could someone so vibrant online be so absent? The name discrepancy kept haunting him. Elizabeth Gonzalez on her nursing license, Elizabeth Martinez on her diploma. When he spotted a faded tattoo on her wrista, tiny M hidden under her watch, he confronted her. "It's my mother's initial," she said quickly. "She passed away," but her voice wavered. Later, he'd research tattoo registries and find no record of that particular ink. During a supply run to the county health department, David overheard a clerk mention a Liz Martinez who'd been fired from a Phoenix clinic years back for unspecified reasons. He pretended to study a bulletin board as his mind raced. Fired? For what? When he returned to Pine Hollow, he found Elizabeth restocking shelves, humming a tune. "Everything okay?" she asked. Fine, he lied. That night, David lay awake, scrolling through cold case databases on his laptop. A name caught his eye, Elizabeth Martinez, implicated in a hospital pharmacy theft in 2018, charges dropped due to witness tampering. His blood turned to ice. The photo attached to the file was grainy but unmistakable. It was her, the woman he admired, the woman he was falling for. A criminal. David's mind was a battlefield. On one side, the woman who'd taught him to mend fences and mix herbal remedies with modern medicine. On the other, the growing pile of lies. He'd always prided himself on his ability to read people. But Elizabeth had him second-guessing everything. One night, after she left for her shift, he slipped into her office, his hands trembling as he opened her desk drawer. Passport photos fell out 3 different IDs. His stomach dropped. The investigation began in secret. David hacked into the clinic's old database, a skill he'd picked up in med school, and cross-referenced Elizabeth's employment history. The Albuquerque clinic she'd mentioned, closed down 5 years prior. The Texas Nursing Board, no records of her ever being licensed there. He dug deeper, accessing public records through a friend's law firm. Bank accounts under various names, all with tiny balances. "You're a ghost," he muttered, staring at the screen. Elizabeth's routine was meticulously tracked. She'd leave the clinic at 8 p.m., drive to a dilapidated apartment on the outskirts of town, and return by 6 a.m. David followed her once, hiding behind a billboard as she unlocked the door. Inside, he glimpsed bare walls, a single suitcase by the door, and a burner phone on the counter. No personal photos, no knickknacks, just survival. The breakthrough came at the county courthouse. David pored through microfilm archives of crime. Reports from 2018. There it was, hospital pharmacy theft suspect fled before arrest. Witness statements mention a nurse named Elizabeth Martinez. The case had gone cold. As he clipped the article, a clerk walked by. "That case ruined a lot of lives," she said. "Heard she stole meds for a sick family member." David's pulse quickened. That evening, David confronted Elizabeth at the clinic. "I need to know the truth," he said, holding up the article. She froze, her eyes widening. "Dave, was it worth it?" he interrupted. "Lying to everyone? To me?" She stepped back, her composure fracturing. "It's complicated," she whispered. "Complicated." He laughed bitterly. "You're a criminal, Liz?" Elizabeth's face hardened. "You think I wanted to live like this?" she snapped. "Hiding, changing names, never staying in one place? You think this was my plan?" Her voice cracked. "I did what I had to. And if you turn me in, every person in this town suffers, because I'll disappear, and you'll never replace me." The air in the clinic felt suffocating as Elizabeth's confession spilled out. She stood by the examination table, her hands gripping the edges as if to steady herself. "I stole medication from a pharmacy," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oxycodone, for my mother." David's mind whirled. The woman who'd taught him to care for the community was a criminal. "Why?" he asked, though he already feared the answer. Elizabeth's eyes welled with tears. She was dying of pancreatic cancer. The pain, it was relentless. Our insurance was gone, our savings depleted. I saw the meds in the pharmacy just sitting there, and I took them, a week's supply. But they caught me. Her voice broke. They charged me with felony theft. David flinched. Felony. The word hung in the air like a verdict. I couldn't let my family deal with the shame, she continued, pacing the small room. My brother had his own kids to raise, so I took a plea deal, got probation, and fled. Changed. My name, my everything. She laughed bitterly. Turns out starting over ain't as easy as they say in the movies. David stood frozen, torn between disgust and pity. "Why stay in the shadows?" he asked, his voice raw. "Why not fight it?" Elizabeth met his gaze, her eyes blazing with a mix of defiance and sorrow. "Because I'd do it again, in a heartbeat. My mother deserved to die pain-free, and if that makes me a criminal, then so be it. Her words were a punch to his gut. David spent the rest of the night researching. Elizabeth's criminal file was sealed, a rarity. Witnesses who testified against her had lost their memories. The presiding judge had retired abruptly. It was as if someone powerful wanted her past buried. But why? And how deep did the cover-up go? At dawn, David returned to the clinic. Elizabeth was already there, restocking the medicine cabinet. "I'm leaving today," she said without turning. "I get it. You can't condone this." He hesitated, then stepped closer. "What if I don't want you to leave?" Her breath hitched. "Then you'd better choose your principles or me." Elizabeth's hands trembled as she recounted the night that changed everything. It was 2 a.m. and Mom was screaming in agony. The cancer had spread, and the pain meds we could afford were useless. Her voice shook. "I saw the pharmacy's back door ajar during a delivery run. 1 week's supply, just enough to get her through her final days." David listened, his anger dissolving into sorrow. "You took the fall," he murmured. "For love," she said simply. The legal battle was brutal. Prosecutors painted her as a calculated thief. Her defense attorney argued desperation. "My mother was dying," Elizabeth testified, tears streaming down her face. "I wanted her last days to be peaceful." The jury wasn't swayed. She was convicted of felony theft, her nursing license revoked. "They treated me like a monster," she whispered, "but they'd do it again." David researched the case files that night. What he found stunned him. Key witnesses had recanted. Security footage disappeared, and the lead investigator retired abruptly. It seemed someone powerful wanted Elizabeth silenced. "Why cover it up?" he muttered, connecting dots to a pharmaceutical company's looming lawsuit over faulty meds. "You weren't just stealing for your mom," he realized aloud. "You exposed their negligence." Elizabeth confirmed it the next morning. The oxycodone batch was contaminated. 3 patients died after using it. "I took the blame to protect my family and to bury the evidence." Her gaze met his. "I failed Mom in the end. She died thinking I was a criminal." David's heart ached. "But you saved others," he said softly. "By keeping quiet, you let them get away with murder." The clinic's director, Clara, revealed more. "Liz worked here under an assumed name because we needed her. The county knew her past, but chose to look the other way until now." David's mind raced. Elizabeth wasn't just a thief, she was a martyr. "You sacrificed everything," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "including your chance at redemption." As Elizabeth packed her meager belongings that evening, David stood in the doorway. "You're not a criminal," he said firmly. "You're a woman who fought for what's right in a broken system." She smiled sadly. "Doesn't change the law." He stepped closer. "Maybe the law needs to change." Elizabeth's apartment was a ghost town. David stood in the doorway, watching her fold a threadbare sweater into a weathered suitcase. The walls were bare, the floor littered with moving boxes. "I'm not staying," she said, her voice steady but her hands betraying her. "I get why you can't help me. You're a doctor with principles." Her words were a dagger. "You're leaving without a fight?" David asked, his tone sharper than intended. She turned, her eyes blazing. "What's the point? The law's already made up its mind." "About me?" She zipped the suitcase shut. "Besides, it's safer for everyone if I'm gone." He noticed the clinic stethoscope peeking out of the bag, a silent testament to her sacrifice. "You're running again," he said softly. She froze. "Is that what you don't think this is?" Her voice wavered. "Or am I finally facing reality?" David stepped forward, his heart pounding. "Reality says you stole meds, but it also says you saved lives." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "Don't make this harder." Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Elizabeth hesitated by the door, her suitcase halfway out. "I wish things were different," she murmured. "Me too," David whispered. The silence between them screamed with unspoken words: stay, fight, love, forgive. As she turned to leave, David's phone buzzed. A news alert flashed: pharmaceutical giant settles lawsuit over contaminated meds. The article detailed how a whistleblower had exposed the company's negligence. David's breath hitched. "Liz," he called, holding up the phone. "Look," Elizabeth read, the headline, her eyes widening. "This changes everything," David said urgently. "They knew the meds were toxic. You weren't just stealing, you were exposing the truth." She stared at him, hope flickering. "But my record." He stepped closer. "Records can be challenged. Truths can be told." Elizabeth's voice trembled as she recounted the final days of her mother's life. She was screaming, "Dave!" The cancer had eaten through her bones, and the pain was so bad she begged me to end it. David sat on the clinic's examination table, his heart heavy. I held her hand while she suffered because I couldn't afford the medication she needed. The raw pain in her voice was a punch to his gut. The hospital prescribed oxycodone, but it cost $1,000 a month. We'd already spent our life savings on treatments that didn't work. Elizabeth's eyes welled with tears. I watched her waste away day by day, while the pharmacy had those pills sitting on the shelf. David's mind raced. He'd seen this story before: families bankrupted by medical debt, patients suffering needlessly. "I took the night shift at the hospital to be closer to her," Elizabeth continued. "One evening, I noticed the pharmacy's back door was unlocked. I slipped in and took a week's supply." She laughed bitterly. 17 pills. That's all it took to keep her comfortable until she passed. David's respect for her swelled, complicating his moral dilemma. "The guilt ate at me," she admitted, "but I'd do it again, 1,000 times over." David nodded, understanding the weight of her choice. "Love makes us do desperate things," he said softly, "even when it means breaking the law." That night, David researched medical bankruptcy statistics. What he found horrified him. 66. 5 of bankruptcies were tied to healthcare costs. Elizabeth's story was painfully common. "We've built a system that criminalizes compassion," he muttered, frustration mounting. As Elizabeth prepared to leave town, David handed her a printed article about a non-profit offering legal aid to those wrongfully convicted for medical reasons. "It's a start," he said. "Maybe we can fight this together." She stared at him, hope flickering. "You'd risk your career for me?" He smiled faintly. "I already have." Elizabeth's sacrifice was a silent scream. After her mother's passing, she faced the court alone, her brother's family depending on her silence. "I couldn't let them carry the burden," she told David, her voice steady, but her eyes reflecting years of pain. The system would have crushed them too. David listened, knowing all too well how the justice system favored the privileged. "After the trial, I disappeared," she continued, "changed my name, moved across states. I worked odd jobs, waitressing, cleaning, anything to stay off the grid." David imagined the loneliness of her journey, the constant fear of being found. "You've been running ever since," he murmured, "running from who you are. I'm not proud of it," she admitted, adjusting her nurse's uniform, a symbol of her dual life. "But every patient I've helped here, every bandage I've put on, every medicine I've administered, its penance. My way of making amends." David's respect for her grew despite the moral quagmire she represented. That evening, David visited Elizabeth's old neighborhood in El Paso. He found her brother, a mechanic with calloused hands and a weary smile. "She's a good woman," the brother said, handing David a faded photo of their mother. "Just trying to survive." David's resolve to help her solidified. "I'll make sure she gets her chance," he promised. Returning to Pine Hollow, David drafted a legal appeal with the nonprofit's help. He gathered affidavits from patients, testimonies of Elizabeth's tireless care, and compiled evidence of the pharmaceutical company's negligence. "This might work," he said to Elizabeth, handing her the stack. "But it'll mean facing the past." Elizabeth stared at the documents, her fingers trembling. "What if I lose?" she asked, fear flickering. David took her hand. "Then we lose together. But if we win, you get your life back." She smiled through tears. A second chance. David's heart pounded as he stared at the legal documents spread across the clinic's desk. Elizabeth's fate hung in the balance, and he was the one holding the scales. "You're risking everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He met her gaze, his eyes reflecting the weight of his decision. "I can't ignore what's right," he replied, though his voice wavered. The ethical dilemma tore at him. As a doctor, he'd sworn to uphold the law and protect his license. But as a man, he'd fallen for someone who'd broken the law for love. "Justice isn't always black and white," he muttered, recalling his own failures, the patients he'd lost, the divorce he'd botched. "Maybe this is my chance to fix something." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "If this goes public, you'll lose your career," she warned. "And I'll still go to jail." David's mind raced. "What if we prove the pharmaceutical company's negligence? Show that you were protecting your family from a system that failed them?" Her hope flickered. "Can we do that?" That night, David drafted a plan. They'd need evidence, emails, testimonies, anything linking the company to the contaminated meds. He reached out to a journalist friend who'd exposed corporate corruption before. "This is dangerous," the friend warned, "but it's the right fight." As dawn broke, David stood at Elizabeth's door, the evidence in a sealed envelope. "I'm ready," he said. She took his hand, her touch steady. "No matter what happens," she said, "thank you for believing in me." He smiled faintly. "I believe in us." Together, they drove to the county courthouse, the morning sun casting long shadows. David's hands gripped the wheel tightly. "No matter the outcome," he said, "we're in this together." Elizabeth nodded, her resolve strengthening his. "Always." Elizabeth stood by the window of her apartment, her suitcase packed and ready. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. She glanced at the clinic's stethoscope on the table, a symbol of her life here. "It's time to go," she whispered to herself. Just then, David knocked on the door. She hesitated, then opened it. "I'm leaving," she said flatly. "I understand," but David's eyes betrayed his words. "Wait," David said, stepping inside. He held up a newspaper, clipping a report about the pharmaceutical company's settlement over contaminated medications. "They knew the meds were toxic," he explained, his voice trembling with emotion. "You weren't just stealing for your mom, you exposed their negligence." Elizabeth stared at the article, her breath catching. "This changes everything," David continued. "We can fight this together." Elizabeth's mind raced. The evidence David presented was compelling, but years of hiding had made her wary. "What if it backfires?" she asked, her voice laced with fear. "What if they come after you too?" David took her hand in his. "I'm not backing down," he said firmly. "I'll stand by you no matter what." His words were a beacon of hope in the storm of uncertainty. Together they returned to the clinic. David spent the afternoon drafting legal documents while Elizabeth called the non-profit organization that helped wrongfully convicted individuals. The director listened intently to their story, then promised to assist with their case. "This might be your chance for redemption," the director said, "but it won't be easy." That evening, David and Elizabeth sat on the clinic's porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in warm hues. "I never thought I'd find someone who'd fight for me like this," Elizabeth said softly. David squeezed her hand. "I never thought I'd find someone worth fighting for." The moment stretched between them, fragile yet powerful. As night fell, David reviewed the legal documents one last time. Elizabeth leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "No matter what happens," she said, "I'm grateful for this." David kissed the top of her head. "We're in this together," he whispered. The words echoed in the quiet night, a promise of hope and resilience. The decision hung in the air like a lifeline. David stood at the clinic's window, staring at the morning fog that blanketed Pine Hollow. Elizabeth's confession replayed in his mind, the stolen meds, her mother's suffering, the cover-up. He couldn't unhear it, but he also couldn't ignore the love that had grown between them. "What do we do now?" she'd asked, her voice trembling. He turned, resolve hardening in his chest. "We fight." The plan took shape over coffee and frantic research. They'd need evidence, documents, testimonies, anything to expose the pharmaceutical company's negligence. David called in favors from old medical, school friends, hacked into forgotten databases, a skill honed during quieter moments in the city, and even enlisted the clinic's director, Clara, who'd long suspected Elizabeth's past but stayed silent out of loyalty. Elizabeth's role was just as critical. She'd reach out to those she'd helped in her previous life, the families she'd supported, the patients she'd cared for, even those who'd witnessed her arrest. One call led to another, and soon a network of voices emerged, each willing to testify about the contaminated meds and the system that failed them. "For your mom," one tearful widow said, "and for all the others." The turning point came when David uncovered a series of emails between the pharmaceutical company's executives discussing the contaminated batch and their decision to ship it anyway to cut costs. "This is gold," he whispered, forwarding the files to their lawyer. The evidence was undeniable, a corporate cover-up that prioritized profit over human life. As the legal battle loomed, David and Elizabeth's relationship deepened. Late nights were spent poring over documents, but also sharing quiet moments of vulnerability. One evening, as they sat on the clinic's porch, Elizabeth rested her head on David's shoulder. "No matter what happens," she said, "thank you for believing in me." He kissed her temple. "I believe in us." The morning of the hearing arrived, heavy with tension. Pine Hollow's residents gathered outside the courthouse, a show of support that moved David to his core. Elizabeth, dressed in a simple dress that made her look both fragile and strong, squeezed his hand. "Ready?" she asked. He nodded, always. The courtroom was packed. Patients from Pine Hollow filled the gallery, their presence a testament to Elizabeth's impact on their lives. David sat beside her, his posture steady despite the storm of emotions inside. The prosecutor's voice droned on about felony theft, but David's mind was fixed on the evidence they'd gathered, the emails, the testimonies, the truth that was finally seeing the light. When David took the stand as a character witness, his voice carried the weight of his conviction. "Elizabeth is the most compassionate person I know," he said, recounting how she'd treated patients with dignity, fought for their well-being, and mended fences both literal and metaphorical. The gallery listened, their faces reflecting newfound respect. The defense attorney presented the pharmaceutical company's emails, projecting them onto a screen for all to see. Gasps filled the room as jurors read the executive's cold calculations. One email stood out: "Ship the batch. The risk is minimal and the profit is worth it." David's pulse quickened. This was their moment. Elizabeth's testimony was a cathartic release. She spoke of her mother's suffering, the desperation that drove her to steal, and the years of living in fear. "I did what I had to," she said, her voice breaking, "but I've also spent years making amends." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The verdict, when it came, was a triumph. "Not guilty," the foreman declared, and the gallery erupted. Patients hugged Elizabeth, tears streaming down their faces. David's heart swelled with pride and relief. "This isn't just for you," he whispered to her. "It's for everyone who's been wronged." Back in Pine Hollow, the clinic's whiteboard gained a new message: second chances are real. Elizabeth received her nursing license reinstated, her record expunged. She and David planned to start a non-profit advocating for medical debt reform, using their story as a beacon of hope. As they stood on the clinic's porch, watching the sunset, Elizabeth leaned into David. "Still think him a criminal?" she teased. He kissed her forehead. Nah, just my partner in chaos. As the curtain falls on Dr. David Sanchez and Elizabeth Gonzalez, journey, we're left with a profound reminder: love and justice, though often at odds, can converge in the most unexpected ways. Their story isn't merely about second chances, it's a testament to the transformative power of honesty, courage, and the resilience of the human spirit. It challenges us to reconsider the stark lines we draw between right and wrong, and to acknowledge the complex circumstances that shape our choices. David's decision to stand by Elizabeth, despite her past, highlights a crucial truth: redemption isn't always found in forgiveness from others, but often in the willingness of others to believe in us. Their partnership evolved from mutual respect to quiet admiration, and ultimately to a love that refused to be silenced by societal norms or legal boundaries. We hope this tale has resonated with you, stirring emotions and prompting reflection. The journey of David and Elizabeth is one that mirrors real-life struggles where love demands sacrifice and justice requires compassion. It's a reminder that our capacity to understand and empathize can be as healing as any medical intervention. If this story has touched your heart or ignited your mind, we invite you to engage with us. Give this video a thumbs up. It's not just a click, but a connection to the themes that matter. Take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. Did you anticipate Elizabeth's secret from the beginning, or did it catch you off guard? How do you interpret David's choice to fight for her instead of exposing her past? What would you have done in his position? Your perspectives enrich our community and inspire meaningful dialogue. For those moved by this tale of love and redemption, consider subscribing to our channel. By doing so, you'll never miss another story that delves into the intricate tapestry of human emotion and ethical complexity. Our content aims to provoke thought, evoke feeling, and sometimes to challenge the very notions we hold dear. Remember, the most unforgettable stories are those that leave us not just entertained, but transformed. They linger in our thoughts, prompting us to examine our own lives and choices. We're grateful for the opportunity to share David and Elizabeth's journey with you, and we look forward to continuing this dialogue in future videos.